The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Want the real story behind the sound bites and headlines? Let's find the facts. Remember, it's not a conspiracy theory if it's the truth. You are not paranoid or confused. You just need to know.
Welcome in, everybody. It's time for another edition of Everything You Need to Know. Kip Keefer with you, and we are always delighted to have our listeners on board as we discuss whatever is pertinent in each particular week. Proud to be here on Tony Kurre Radio and have a lot of things to discuss today. And I'm going to have a little bit of a theme, I think, for this particular broadcast. Let's call this things that people hear and don't really pay attention to. And I have been having the experience in the past week of coming across a number of stories and waiting for visceral reaction from John Q. Public and from other sources and people to follow up on their opinions on these stories that get my attention. And a lot of them just kind of are reported and you just don't hear anything else about it. And I think it's very indicative of the times that anything that's not in the direct vacuum that is so many people's lives, it just kind of gets ignored. Either that or we've become so conditioned to shocking headlines and things happening that we're just desensitized and not reactive to situations that I find to be absolutely consequential. And we can start with one of the main things in the news, and we've certainly talked about it ad nauseum. And again, I don't want to keep beating the same drum, but it absolutely amazes me watching all of the events in Washington unfold with the House Oversight Committee's very thorough investigation and the parade of witnesses that keep coming forward that add more and more what you would think would be nails in the Biden crime family coffin. And yet it seems to be shrugged off. It's still dismissed by partisans as, well, they haven't proven anything, and it's baseless, and it's a waste of our time. We should be concentrating on things that are important to these current Americans. Of course, those things are the economy, the border, all the things that are wrong with the country that these people have exacerbated and even created in a lot of ways. But the latest evidence was last Monday in a closed door hearing. Devin Archer, the former partner and best friend, business partner and best friend of Hunter Biden, testified before the committee. Now, admittedly, Archer's facing a severe sentence for a securities fraud, totally unrelated to the Bidens. And of course, the implication has been, well, he's just testifying to get his sentence reduced. They've made a deal with him. Of course, there's no deal that compares to what Hunter Biden was being offered that fell through because a judge with some integrity asked a couple of questions and made that deal blow up. The plea deal that Hunter Biden strolled into the courtroom last week and thought he was just going to, answer guilty and plead guilty and given a slap on the wrist for just a couple of minor offenses, completely not reporting any of the millions of dollars he received for his job as a board member of Burisma, an energy company in Ukraine. He just didn't bother to disclose that income, $84,000 on his tax return. No big deal, no harm, no foul. We're going to bust that down from a felony to a misdemeanor on both of those years. And of course, the 2 years previous to that, which have now run past the 7-year limit and statute of limitations. So those are just forgiven with no implications whatsoever. And the other one was the gun charge the felony gun charge when Hunter Biden purchased a firearm for who knows what. And he did not disclose on his forms to qualify to purchase a handgun that he had been discharged dishonorably from the Navy for drug addiction and had been in rehab treatment a number of times, which disqualifies you from being able, until a longer waiting period, to purchase a firearm. He completely did not disclose that information, which is basically falsifying his application. And I think I told you last week on the show, ironically, it was his father in the creation of the laws as far as what needs to be disclosed to have a firearm, who insisted on stiff penalties for anyone who falsified their application in the Brady gun bill back from the early 90s. That came to light that Joe Biden was the adamant sponsor of severe penalties for lack of disclosure or falsification. And yet Hunter was going to skate with a, quote, diversion program, which was going to educate him on what he did wrong and kind of put him on the right path. Basically, it was a deal that no other U.S. citizen has ever been offered for that offense. And it's something that if you or I were accused of that, we would be wearing an orange jumpsuit right now and eating our 3 squares a day of watery soup, bread, and water. So the whole suggestion that there's no uneven application of the law is absolutely laughable in this matter. So to make a long story short, Archer really spilled the beans and completely decimated under sworn testimony the Joe Biden continuous contention that he did not have any knowledge and had never had any discussion of his son's business. Now, his son's business, what exactly was his son's business? His son's business was his father, Joe Biden, the vice president, and his product was selling access and influence to his father, the vice president, now President Joe Biden, to a score of international investors and governments, many of whom are our geopolitical opponents and people that are trying to get a leg up on overtaking this country for world dominance in military might and financial dominance. So it's akin to treason, basically, what the Bidens were doing. And they have the records. The Oversight Committee has records of some $17 million in payment transfers from international transactions. This is a big deal, folks. This is not anything that's ever been recorded in the annals of American history. There have been scandals, but not direct payments to the then vice president of the United States and his brother and his son and his other brother and his daughter and his his current wife and his grandchildren, all the way down the line. 11 different Bidens have gotten money from shell companies that have been set up to channel money from overseas. This is not conjecture. This is fact. And you know what the reaction is from American people overall? That's really remarkable. No one seems to be particularly outraged. The DC swamp in Washington particularly is indifferent and denying that there's anything wrong or anything unlawful in this situation. And I think the reason for this dynamic is twofold. One, if you've been listening to Need to Know, I have harped continuously on the fact that I find it absolutely unbelievable that this situation exists and American people don't care, that when people go into politics and become Washington congressional representatives, staffers, department bureau and agency heads or management people, that these people go into government with rather ordinary means, and that can range. Ordinary means, of course, that's defined by this White House as anyone making under $400,000 a year, which to me is a pretty considerable sum, but that's another subject. But these people go in as pretty much average citizens into these jobs, including many congressional folks and people that become senators. Now, there's a lot of them that have big means to start and buy their way in initially. But if you find yourself in Congress and stick around for 8, 9, 12 years, whatever, multiple terms, it's amazing how people come out of these situations going in with average means and coming out multimillionaires. And why that doesn't just absolutely confound and outrage the American public just is beyond me. But I've been talking about this for a long time. Harry Reid had declared bankruptcy. The longtime senator from Nevada who recently passed away became a very powerful senator. He's the absolute poster child for what I'm saying, because just a couple of years before he was elected to the Senate from Nevada, he had to declare bankruptcy because he was a terrible businessman. And, for whatever other reasons that happens to people. But Harry Reid goes in, has a 30-year career in the Senate. And I think the starting salary at the time that Harry Reid started was about $130,000 a year. It's up to $180,000 now. And that's pretty good chunk of change for your annual job. But that's not the kind of money that you are going to come out as, worth $25 or $30 million. So that money is being channeled into these individuals. And I think American people just accept that's just kind of how things work. And it amazes me that no one does the calculation to say, well, if they're getting all this money from all these side sources, people aren't just giving it to them to express their appreciation. They're buying influence and trying to get what they want out of these contributions. And I mean, any common sense will tell you that a big pharmaceutical company is not going to stuff a congressional person's pockets full of money for nothing. It's in exchange for them not necessarily being on the front lines supporting bills and legislation that comes along that will aid their entities, although, of course, that's the desired effect. But it's also to effectively kill bills that are proposed that they think would be detrimental for business. It's buying influence. That's exactly what it is. And anyone who thinks otherwise is either naive or doesn't think or just doesn't have the capacity to reach a sensible conclusion. And the reason there's no outrage in Washington is very simple, because these people are not going to react to this, because this is the way the game is played. This is what they're there for. I wish there were people, and there's a handful, I'm sure, that are there committed to doing the best job for the American people and representing the constituents that sent them there. And their priority is what's best for America and best for our citizens and what's needed to make our country thrive and grow and be great. But unfortunately, it is not public service in this day and age. It is undeniably almost exclusively self-service. This is one of the greatest gigs you can possibly have. Why do you think politicians fight so hard, tooth and nail, to be sent back there time after time after time? Because you basically don't pay for anything. You bank every bit of the salary that you receive, and you are continuously assaulted by the barrage of checks and contributions coming your way, again, not because you're a swell guy or gal, but because you are being compensated, hoping to curry your support for whatever the entity that's paying you is. So again, Washington, this is business as usual, and they don't want to make an issue of what's happening with the Bidens. I'm sure a lot of people are shaking their head and of the audacity and the extent that the Biden crime family has taken to cash in on good old Joe's lofty positions. And never has someone so limited intellectually ever achieve what Joe Biden has achieved. And his family, believe me, has cashed in on it. And so has Joe, having two just stately manors in the state of Delaware and all kinds of holdings now that are starting to pop up in the form of offshore bank accounts. The Bidens have cashed in big time on Joe influence, and anyone who doesn't see that is just not looking at things from a practical manner, or looking through the blue that represents the Democrat Party, looking through blue tinted glasses and just can't see the obvious. So that all being said, that if that's not enough of what we're not paying attention to, there's other stories I thought I would mention real quick that have come to light in the past week that have really gotten very little attention or play in the media. It was mentioned early last week that in I think it's Readyville, California, which is near Fresno in the central part of the state, there was a bio lab that was operating there that was, I guess, getting suspicion in terms of what they were actually doing there when it came to light that this was a Chinese-owned facility that didn't have the proper licenses. And when authorities finally inspected it, they found something shocking on American soil, that this was very much like the Wuhan lab in China, where it's obvious that the COVID-19 virus was developed and, of course, then later spread across the planet. Do you know, in this lab in California, they found all kinds of experimental materials and actually stored different components of different diseases, including COVID-19 and HIV and various other coronaviruses, and even things like herpes. There was all kinds of really destructive drugs being developed and tested openly in this lab, similar to what was happening in Wuhan. And there were like thousands of mice in various states of, a lot of them were dead, a lot of them were desperately ill, a lot of them were acting erratically. So clearly this was a lab to test all kinds of different engineered drugs. And that's what, if you've listened to the show, it has come to light that COVID-19 was an experimental situation in that lab where they took conventional coronavirus from the SARS family of that particular description and introduced other agents into that to make it more contagious and make it more difficult to treat through the inducement of protein compounds and other things. This was not a natural phenomenon. This was man-made, and it certainly appears in this lab in California, that's what was going on our soil by a Chinese entity. And it was mentioned the one time, and I have not heard it mentioned again. I didn't see anybody who was particularly outraged. Why do we just shrug things off in our society that are seemingly highly significant? Another one. There's been talk. There was a hearing in the House also. I can't remember which committee it was, but they brought in various experts that were now blowing the whistle that the United States government for decades and decades have been covering up and concealing all kinds of knowledge about possible extraterrestrial and UFO presence that have not been explained. There was one expert who had very solid credentials that said he has personal knowledge that the U.S. government has the wreckage of crafts and even remains of some kind of individuals that are not human, that he called them biologicals, that the government has never disclosed that they have in their possession. And now I hear that just this morning that there was a mysterious crash from something moving at an unbelievable rate of speed into the Pacific Ocean in the recent weeks, and that it apparently is not based on a rock formation like you'd find from a meteor crashing to Earth, that this was something almost completely metallic. Now, it could be some sort of natural phenomenon, but the speed it was moving and the characteristics it exhibited before crashing into the ocean were not consistent with what you would find in a meteor situation. And they've apparently, through sonar, located whatever this wreckage or whatever crashed to the Earth. And there's going to be salvage situations to see if they can bring it up and identify what it is. But there's all kinds of that kind of thing going on. And it's amazing to me that there's some late night mentions of it by comedians, and there's some people kind of playing it off, but it's kind of laughed off like it's some big joke. But if there's actual evidence of other life that has been involved with this planet, I think that's kind of a significant story, and no one seems to care. I guess people don't really want to believe it, or have just decided that that's all a bunch of bunk. But I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire, and you've got senior military officials and people that were involved in government actually coming forward and saying, folks, you've been being hoodwinked for a long, long time. The U.S. government is actively involved and has all kinds of knowledge of these subjects, and they've kept you completely in the dark. And if there's any validity, it's certainly worth the attention of the American people, but again, just doesn't seem to resonate whatsoever. Let's go to the border real quick. The U.S.-Mexican border is, of course, the hotbed for a bunch of migration every day. By all reports, since the Biden administration has been on board, they have basically opened the doors and welcomed in between 6 and 7 million people from all around the world. These aren't just people from depressed areas or evil regimes that are trying to escape and seek asylum. These are people that are being flown from other continents to Mexico through foundations like George Soros, a number of his, we talked about the Biden shell business. He has all these shell charitable organizations, but basically they want a major invasion of this country to continue to destabilize and weaken our infrastructure and our ability economically to keep up. So we've had this mass surge of people. So that nefarious group gets them to the continent in Mexico and stages them. But then the next step in the process is the most organized and now probably most lucrative crime operations in the history of mankind. These massive, and there's two huge ones and other smaller ones, these massive cartels that are literally making billions of dollars. Drug trafficking has become a sideline because human trafficking and transmission and transportation and acclimation to get them across the border has become the primary focus of these groups. And they are brazen in their violations. There's drone footage of guards walking around and hurting people carrying AR weapons, and they're well equipped. They basically have bought influence in Mexico and are running that entire country. This is the most sophisticated criminal operation. And if that doesn't bother you, what about the human trafficking? Again, not just getting people across the border, but choosing and exploiting so many women and children. And basically, and this is just sickening to even mention, basically pimping them out as sexual slaves, for lack of a better term. And it's just so hard to think about. And if you don't think this is realistic, there are so many documentaries now and testimonials of people that have managed to escape this, that tell their stories about how they just were constantly abused and used as basic human sex slaves under the direction of these cartels. And what about the societal problems that that's going to cause in recent years? Your heart has to go out to a 10 or 11-year-old child, and this is boys and girls, and young women just entering puberty and young adulthood. And this is the introduction to the world that they're getting. How are these people going to be well adjusted in the years to come? This is going to cause just unbelievable mental health problems and aberrant behavior, and just millions of individuals that possibly have been subjected to this. And how can they live a normal life? These are the people that are migrating into our country and going to be among us, and they're going to become our responsibility to try and care for and treat and heal. But how do you overcome that as a 10 or 11-year-old child? It's things we should think about. And I think I mentioned it briefly, but these cartels and what's happening in Mexico, this is the greatest terrorist organization and crime enterprise we've ever seen in a bordering country, and they're running that country. Make no mistake about it. This is a military situation for our country. This is where we arm ourselves, declare war on these cartels, and go down there and wipe them out. That's the way it's going to have to be, unless you let them get more and more powerful. You've got to stop it right now when it's at its peak. And people in America need to care about this stuff. It's just shocking that we continue to have our head in the sand and just hope everything works out and goes away. And, I have even friends that tell me, well, there's just so much you can do. And to me, the incredulity, and I am absolutely outraged when I hear things like I just described, and there's just almost no attention to them. So the American people, again, I say this every show, we are the government. It's we the people, and we the people better step up and get better representation in Washington and get leadership to kind of take the reins for all of these challenges that we just shrug off and pretend like don't exist. So it's time for everybody to mobilize and at least be aware and be involved in your own lives and your own government. And most importantly, the future of your children and grandchildren. I've got my lone grandson who will be 3 years old next week, and I shudder at what future his life might be as the way things are going here. And I don't want to sound like Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. It is not falling yet, but there are a lot of things lining up to make that happen. So there's some things that I wanted to talk about this week. And I think you need to know it's time for everybody to pay attention to what's happening and speak up. Do not be intimidated. Do not be threatened with cancellation or ridicule, which are the weapons that this nefarious movement uses to silence you. Censorship, your right to First Amendment, free speech, free expression is something that every American has to do. And the best place to make a statement is at the ballot box, not necessarily voting for one party or another, but sending people with integrity and commitment to doing what's best for your district. We can start one area at a time, or your state in terms of your senators. Elect the right people, don't keep sending the same people that are cashing in back repeatedly. That's something that Americans do in just reflexively, and I don't understand it. Scrutinize the people that you've sent there, and if they're not doing the job for you and your area of the country, then send somebody else that you have more confidence in. That's how you can make the loudest and longest statement in the longevity of this country. I'm Kip Keefer. That's my thoughts this week on Need to Know. Hope you had some nugget of information there that will inspire your perspective, and we will join you again at this same time next week.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.